All right, I knew I needed 2 videos, but I lost track of time. So this is part 2 of the optional assignment. Whoops, too far. The optional assignment on sign analysis and drawing of a graph of polynomials. So let's go ahead and continue on number 3. There we go. So for number 3, we need to find the interval between 0 and 1. So that's going to be domain interval 0 to 1. Our number that we're going to test is right in between, which again, just like over here, we had negative 0.5. We're going to have positive 0.5 that we're going to test. So when we test that, positive squared is going to give us a positive. Anything squared is positive. And then 1 plus 0.5 is going to be positive. And 1 minus 0.5 is still positive. Squared is always going to be positive. So we're going to be in the positive direction for that interval. Let's go ahead and take a look at the last interval for this one. Let's go for blue. So it's going to continue on all the way to positive infinity. So from 1 to positive infinity. And we can test any value between 1 and positive infinity. Let's go ahead and test 2. Now we substitute it back in, so 2 squared is just going to give us 4, which is positive. And then 1 plus 2, which is just going to give us 3, which is positive. And 1 minus 2, which is going to give us negative, but negative squared is going to give us a positive value, and that is overall positive. So 3 positives in a row. So when we graph this, we're going to end up, and I'm going to go to a black line, we're going to end up starting off in the negative direction. So our end behavior is negative on the left side, and then it's going to come up. It needs to come back down, tangent, up, tangent, and then all the way up, kind of like a roller coaster. So this point is because of the -1, we're going to start off, that's going to cross, just like our middle term tells us that it's going to do. Our next one is going to be tangent, because it's squared right here. And then our last point is tangent as well. So tangent squared, it's going to go up and then kind of bounce and then come back up. Point tangent to the x-axis. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at number 4. So with number 4, first step, go ahead and identify the zeros. So our zeros in this case are negative x squared equals 0. That's all going to simplify to 0. This is going to end up being -4. This is going to be the cube root of 0, which is just 0, and that's going to end up being a positive 4. So let's go ahead and graph those 3 points, and we're going to have 4 intervals, domain intervals between them. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. There's -4 to 1, 2, 3, 4, positive 4. And we also have 0. And let's go ahead and test our domain intervals. So I'm going to start off with red, and we are going from -infinity all the way to -4. So that's going to be our first domain interval that we're going to look at. Okay, and for that value, I'm going to go ahead and test -5. So when I test -5, I'm going to end up with -5 squared and then a negative in front. So that's going to end up giving me a negative value because of the negative in front. Next one, we're going to end up with -5 plus 4, which is negative. And -5 minus 4, which is going to give us a -9. Negative cubed is always going to be the sign that it starts off with. So it would end up being a negative value. So negative times a negative is positive. Positive times that last negative is going to end up giving us a negative value. Same here. Hey, negative times a negative is a positive. And then positive times the negative is negative. So we know in this interval that our value, our solution to the graph is going to end up being negative between -infinity to -4. All right. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one, which is going to be between -4 and 0. So that's going to be our domain interval, -4 to 0. we're going to test a different value. A value we're going to test on this one is -1. And we're going to substitute it back in. So -1 squared is positive, but there's a negative in front, so that would be negative. And then -1 plus 4. -1 plus 4 is +3. And -1 minus 4, which is negative. Negative cubed is going to be negative. Multiply these two negatives together, we end up with a positive. Positive times a positive is positive. So we know that the graph is going to end up having a positive solution above. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. Let's go ahead and stick with these colors. Okay, so we're going to look at the domain interval, the values between 0 and 4. A good test point for that, I'm going to stick with 1. So we're going to check between 0 and 4. And when I substitute 1 back in, I end up with 1 squared, which is just 1, but we end up with a negative in front. And we would have 1 plus 4, which is positive. 1 minus 4, which is -3. -3 cubed is going to end up being negative. Negative times a negative is positive. So we end up with a positive sign here. All right, let's go ahead and test. I'm going to switch that color. Let's go to green. Whoops, I don't know why I did that. Okay, so for the last interval, we're going to test from 4 all the way to positive infinity. Okay, so from 4 to positive infinity, we're going to test the value 5. So when we substitute 5 in, 5 squared is going to give us a positive, but that negative in front still stays negative. And then 5 plus 4 is positive. 5 minus 4 is 1. 1 cubed is going to end up being positive. So we end up with negative times a positive, which is negative. Negative times positive, which is overall negative. So our value, our solution, is going to be below the x-axis. Okay, now back to what we were talking about with the exponents. This is to the first power, this is to the third, to the third power. So we are at 0, that's going to be a point tangent. I'm going to switch to black because it's squared, and then our solution set for -4 is going to end up being to the first power, so that's going to cross. And then see that third, that's going to be our point of inflection, which is going to be right here because it's to the third power. So as I draw this, the graph is going to start from the negative direction for end behavior on the left side. It's going to go up, then it's going to come back down. We do have a tangent line, and then we're going to go up. And then we have to go back down because our solutions are down here, but we do have a point of inflection, so it's going to kind of go like that. Okay, it's going to have like a little wiggle as it crosses the x-axis, but wiggle is not quite a mathematical terminology, so that is a point of inflection, which you will be using later on in mathematics. Okay, all right, so there's that graph. Let's go ahead and take a look at number 5. Now with number 5, we do have two different terms. So we're going to take a look at the first term, which is x minus 3. Our zeros for this equation, our polynomial, is 0 and -2. So that's going to start at 0 and at -2. Okay, and we're going to first start looking at the domain interval between -infinity to -2. So we're going to test our solutions. Our first solution, our first test point we're going to try is -3. So we're going to see if it's above or below that graph. So when I substitute -3 in, as an -3 cubed is going to end up being negative, and then 2 plus -3 is going to give us a negative. Negative times a negative gives us a positive. All right, so we know that the graph is going to be above the x-axis between negative infinity to -2. Let's go ahead and test the next domain interval, which is going to be between -2 to 0. So -2, 0 is going to be our domain interval. I'm going to test -1. So when I substitute -1 back in, I'm going to end up with -1 cubed, which is going to end up being negative. And then 2 plus -1, which would just be +1. So that's positive. Negative times a positive gives us a negative value. So that's going to dip below the x-axis. Next domain interval is going to be from 0 to positive infinity. Okay, so we're going to start off with 0 to positive infinity. Pick a point to test. We're going to test 1 because it's easy to substitute in. 1 cubed is going to give us a positive sign. And then 2 plus 1 would just give us a positive sign. Positive times a positive gives me a positive value, so I know that the graph is going to be above. Looking at this, I know that I end up having a point of inflection here based off of the first term, so we end up with a point of inflection because of the cube. And then the next term at -2, this is going to end up crossing because it's to the first power. Now we just go ahead and fill in our polynomial. So it's going to be positive continuing on down. Whoops, I don't want that to look like a point of inflection. Okay, it's going to be positive continuing on down. Now it's negative, it's going to continue. It has to go up to the positive direction. This is a point of inflection, so it's going to be cubic. So I'm going to go ahead and graph it kind of with a little wiggle over the x-axis. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at number 6. With number 6, we have two different terms, cubic and a squared term. We first need to find our zeros. So the zeros, set that equal to 0. And the first term would be -1 and +2. So I'm going to go ahead and graph that. So that's going to end up being -1, +2. I'm going to identify at the moment what's happening at that -1 because of the cubic. This is going to be a point of inflection. And because of the squared, this is going to end up being a point that is tangent. That's going to come into play next week as well. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and determine the domain interval on that side of -1. So I'm going to go ahead and identify the domain interval, which is going to be from -infinity to 1. And we're going to test a point. I'm going to test -2, and that's -1. So when I test -2, substitute that in. That'd be -2 plus 1, which is going to give me a negative value. A negative cubed is always going to be its own value, or the same value. And then if anything is squared, I don't really need to do the math in here. Anything squared is always going to be positive. Okay, so negative times a positive gives me a negative value. So down here, I know that I'm going to end up having a negative solution. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look at the next. I'm going to change it to green. It's kind of hard to see the difference between orange and red. So between -1 to 2, we're going to pick a value and we're going to pick 0. So when we pick 0, substitute that in. 0 plus 1, 1 cubed is going to give us a positive value. Anything squared is positive. Okay, so that's positive, positive. Now let's go ahead and take a look at blue. We're going to take a look at this interval domain interval, which is going to be from 2 all the way to positive infinity. So from 2 to positive infinity, I can pick any value. Let's just pick 3. 3 plus 1 is going to give us positives cubed is itself. And then we would end up with 3 minus 2. 3 minus 2 is positive squared. Positive times a positive. That's going to also continue to go in the positive direction. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the graph is doing. Starts off, my left behavior is negative, so it continues to go up. I am leading up to a point of inflection, so it would be best to kind of have it as looking like a cubic function, or kind of have that little wiggle point of inflection over the x-axis. Now it is positive, it's going to continue to be positive, but I know there's a solution right at 2, so I need to come back down. kind of go up like a quadratic and continue on. So that's going to be what our graph looks like.